What's up, everybody? Welcome into the Next Pats podcast. We are shifting gears ever so slightly this week on Next Pats because, again, we have plenty of work to do in terms of familiarizing ourselves with this new Patriots rookie class. But there is one storyline with the Patriots that is still dominant, and it is what's going to happen with Stephon Gilmore. And we've all laid our takes out there, but we haven't really worked our way into the nitty-gritty details. If you're Bill Belichick, what are you hoping gets Stephon Gilmore on the field in terms of a contract adjustment? If you're Stephon Gilmore, what do you need to get back on the field? How did the new rules established in the CBA signed last offseason maybe steer Gilmore away from continuing his holdout into training camp? All of these little details, we wanted to get into them, and we wanted to bring in our buddy, friend of the podcast, Joel Corry. He writes for CBSSports.com. He hosts the Inside the Cap podcast with Joel Corry. Phenomenal guest for us because he's able to teach us all the ins and outs of what a contract might look like. He's a former agent. He's been at the negotiating table with the Patriots before, so he knows how Bill Belichick operates, how he has functioned over the course of his 20-plus years here in New England. So tremendous for us to have Joel on the podcast this week. And we're just going to take you right into our conversation with Joel Corry. Very excited to have with us now Joel Corry, the host of the Inside the Cap podcast with Joel Corry, to talk with us a little bit about the Gilmore situation. Joel, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So this is a little bit of a complicated deal here, Joel, because it feels like the Patriots are all in on this 2021 season, and Bill Belichick really wants to win based on how he and really Robert Kraft spent this offseason. And yet they still have this lingering piece where their number one corner doesn't show up to mandatory minicamp, and they still don't have a deal done as we're recording this podcast on Wednesday afternoon. So I know you have some takes on this because I listened to your recent episode of the Inside the Cap podcast, and you talk about this. But one of the things that stood out to me is you talk about how the Patriot Way, quote unquote, is involved here. How do you think the Patriot Way and how Bill Belichick has done business in the past might impact these negotiations?
Well, when most people say Patriot Way, they think of the whole do your job mantra. But to me, being a former agent, the Patriot Way has been, it's better to get rid of a player a year too early as opposed to a year too late. That's applied to practically every player except Tom Brady. I remember there's a time when the Patriots were a Super Bowl contender and traded away Richard Seymour to the Raiders, and that may have cost them a Super Bowl. Gilmore will be 31 in September, and cornerbacks don't have a great track record of playing well into their 30s. So he would be a prime candidate for the Patriots to decide, you know what, this is maybe the tail end of his prime. We don't want to extend him. Let's move on. But the Patriots didn't spend all that money on characteristically in free agency and then not really address cornerback in the draft or free agency to not have Gilmore on the team. So that's an interesting dichotomy they have there, in my opinion.
No doubt. And I would think in some ways it gives Gilmore leverage, right? Is that how you view it? I mean, we know your experience as an agent. You've been at the negotiating table, with the Patriots before. Joel, is it that easy that even, sort of the layperson can look at it and say, well, Patriots need a number one corner. They have J.C. Jackson, who's been pretty good, but I don't know if he's at that level. And if they really want to win and they want to win with defense and kind of managing the game on the offensive side, which is sort of how it looks right now, does Gilmore kind of hold the hammer here to some extent?
Yeah, to a degree, because Belichick with Robert Kraft's checkbook did make all these moves to be 7-9 again and miss the playoffs. So if they don't have Gilmore around, they don't have another number one corner on the team. So, yeah, it does give them a little bit of leverage. But if I'm the Patriots, I'm hesitant about paying him on a go-forward basis because rarely do you have cornerbacks years 32, 33, and 34, which Gilmore would be 2022 and beyond, play at a Pro Bowl level. Champ Bailey did it for a couple of years. He was a Pro Bowler. Charles Woodson at 35, but he was really kind of a hybrid slot corner, then moved to safety the following year. You had Charles Tillman at 31 do it, and Richard Sherman at 31 in 2019. Other than that, past 10 years, you don't have cornerbacks who are in their 30 or 31 and older go to the Pro Bowl. So what you would be getting from Gilmore on a go-for-it basis would most likely be diminishing returns unless he can defy the odds.
I do want to ask you about what you think Gilmore would need to get on the field here. But when it comes to holding out these days, because I remember last offseason, this was really, this became a story to some extent because this was part of the new CBA, was that there had been some new rules and some new penalties installed for players who decided to hold out. It felt like the league really wanted to make it difficult for players to hold out. And it seems to some extent that they've done that. So while we say, Gilmore may have some leverage here, are the penalties significant enough, Joel, in your opinion, that it may force him back on the field sooner than maybe he would like?
Yeah, the penalties now are a pretty good deterrent. If you are a player who is on a veteran contract, then it's $50,000 per day, and that fine can no longer be forgiven. It's mandatory. Training camp is going to run anywhere from 35 to 40 days. So you're looking, if you held out all of training camp, upwards to a $2 million fine. The fines have increased dramatically to deter players from holding out. Then there's another penalty that Gilmore has. Since he signed his contract as an unrestricted free agent, he's also subject to an additional fine that is mandatory of 1 week's salary for each preseason game missed. So 1/18 of his $7 million base salary is slightly under $390,000. So that's $390,000 practically for each preseason game he misses. There are 3 preseason games. So you're basically over $1 million in addition to the potential $2 million in fines. So yeah, that's a pretty dramatic fine that can't be forgiven.
It's steep. And, for a guy, even for a guy who's, he's made tens of millions of dollars over the course of his career, you're sitting there and you're looking at you mentioned just the preseason games alone, you miss those, you're talking close to 1.2 million. And then on top of that, $50,000 a day for every day you miss a training camp. I mean, it's pricey and it gets pricey pretty quickly. And I wonder how much that will impact whatever Gilmore decides to do here. If you were Gilmore, Joel, and if you were representing Gilmore, what would you want to get back on the field? Kind of understanding what the Patriots situation is, but also knowing you might be looking at some steep fines if you miss training camp time.
Well, obviously he wasn't happy with his contract, or they wouldn't have made the adjustment last year where they essentially pulled $4.5 million out of this year's base salary and put it into 2020, then added a incentive that he didn't earn for $2 million for making being defensive player of the year. So I would want a 3-year extension. And to me, the minimum would be in the Darius Slay range. Darius Slay at 29, when he was traded from the Lions to the Eagles, signed a 3-year extension at the time, which made him the highest paid cornerback at the league, for $50.05 million over the 3 years. The structure is very team friendly, so I wouldn't want his structure. But basically, you'd have to get me in the $17 million per year range on an extension, and that would make Gilmore the 4th highest paid cornerback in the league, as currently is the salary pay scale for the position is currently constructed.
It does seem like that Slay deal is a pretty good comp for Gilmore, just based on, Slay's a little bit younger than, when he got his deal versus where Gilmore is now. But Gilmore, I think most people would say at his best, just playing the better player than Slay. So maybe there's a little bit of trade-off there in terms of the age, but also the skill. And so maybe you end up in sort of a similar range. If you're Bill Belichick, Joel, sort of flip it around here. What would you be trying to get away with to get this guy on the field, make him a little bit happier, understanding that he is Bill Belichick and that he may not be willing to overextend himself long-term?
Well, if I'm Belichick, I look to something we did with Tom Brady in the last year that he was a Patriot. His salary went from $15 million to $23 million. They added money in. I wouldn't, if I'm Belichick, I don't want to add $8 million like Brady was given. And they also put in 2 voiding dummy years so they could take the $20 million roster bonus that Brady was given and stretch it out over 3 years because of fully guaranteed roster bonus. Also, Brady had a clause where you couldn't franchise him or give him a transition tag once the 2019 season ended. I wouldn't want to give Gilmore that same clause, but maybe I put his salary back to where it was supposed to be before last year's basically advance at 11.5 million in the base. So maybe I give him 4.5 is the raise. And we don't necessarily have to prorate it because the Patriots have enough cap room where they could absorb an additional 4.5 million all in 2021, as opposed to Brady's situation where they spread out the hit over 3 years and then had a $13.5 million cap charge last year with Brady playing in Tampa. So if I'm Belichick, I'm looking to just do a modest increase to salary he's supposed to make in 2021.
Do you think incentives could be a part of this, Joel? Because we've seen them do that before with Tom Brady. We've seen them do it with other players in the past. Maybe if, my understanding is if you make them not likely to be earned. So if you make, Gilmore say play a certain number of games, he didn't play a full season last year, only played 11 games, or if you give him a certain number of picks to chase and they're reasonable, they're reachable for him. Maybe you could entice him that way. Is that something you could see them doing?
Yeah, that may be the starting point, but if I'm Gilmore, I don't want the incentives because I had a $2 million incentive for repeating as Defensive Player of the Year, which was almost impossible to do. And it didn't happen. He didn't earn it. But you're right. Anything he didn't do in 2020 is statistically, by the CBA approved statistics, is considered not likely to be earned. So you could say like 75% play time because he played 11 games out of the 16. So if he plays 75% of defensive plays, that could be some dollar amount. It could be based on interceptions. You could make something which would be likely to be earned or not likely if you tie it to a team achievement. And the one which I think if the Patriots are going to go that route, they would want would be playoffs. That if your play time is, he played more than 50% last year, 50% and playoffs would be not likely to be earned. Or the Patriots may want to tie all the incentives, maybe have some individual standard at a high level and also playoffs. So there's a world you could do with the incentives, making them not likely to be earned. If I'm Gilmore, I want hard money. I don't want to have to earn it by what I do on the field or how much I participate, because one injury that puts you out for a significant amount of time and you've lost any chance of earning the incentives.
All right, so let's rewind here. You say if you're Gilmore, you're going to want a 3-year extension that pays you almost $17 million a year, maybe right at that $17 million a year number. If you're Bill Belichick, you want to just give him a modest raise for this year, maybe bump him up $4 or $5 million to help make him a little bit happier that way. How do you see this?
That's what I would settle. I would settle for, if I'm Belichick, the modest raise. I'd start with the incentives.
Okay.
Knowing that he probably won't want to take it. If they start biting off on the incentives, then I go down that path. If not, I eventually shift to hard dollars. This is a tough one to see how this goes. I suspect that Belichick is going to resist the long-term deal because he knows how cornerbacks play. There's a reason why they didn't keep Darrelle Revis into his 30s. And we saw what happened with him when he went to the Jets. He fell off a cliff quickly. So you don't want the Stephon Gilmore, who might become the Revis the Jets got when they signed him to the long-term deal. He was a 1-year rental for the Patriots. So I suspect Belichick's going to hold the line and ultimately give him some hard money this year to try to placate Gilmore. We'll see if it's enough for Gilmore to come off of wanting a long-term deal. And then if we can't get anything done, is Gilmore going to be resolved enough to get into the $50,000 per day fine territory? And if the holdout extends long enough, missing game checks of basically $390,000 for each preseason game.
It'll be fascinating to see it play out because it does feel like if you're Gilmore, especially some of the things we've heard coming out of Foxborough where his teammates don't seem all that concerned about Gilmore showing up. They're in constant contact with him. What we know about Gilmore is that he does want to be here, but he wants the new deal too. And so is there something that they could figure out here? It feels like, I think for a lot of us in New England, it feels like something will get worked out because they were so uncharacteristic, as you mentioned, Joel, with all the spending this offseason. And if you do all that and you don't bring back your number one corner and you are looking more like a 500 team than a double-digit win team, what was the point of all the spending in the first place? So it's just one of these things that we're in uncharted territory, because you mentioned it off the top of our conversation. The Patriots typically part with the guy earlier rather than later, but maybe Bill Belichick's changing his stripes. Is that what we're saying here? Maybe there's a chance that he shifts his approach.
Well, we had a change in stripes this year because Bill Belichick rarely would go into the first wave of free agency. Coincidentally, one of the guys he did do that for was Gilmore. That was uncharacteristic. And then this year, they just blew the whole let's be judicious in free agency out of the water and went on a spending spree like we haven't seen the Patriots do under Bill Belichick. So, yeah, maybe he is expanding his horizons and is going to be more flexible than what he's accustomed to doing. But also on the flip side, it's very easy for a player to talk about holding out, and it's a lot harder to actually do it. I have some experience because when I was an agent, I had a couple of guys who had lengthy holdouts from the Jaguars, Jimmy Smith, and then for the Buccaneers, Keenan McCardell. And now with the fines, which are significantly more than they've been at any other point in NFL history, that will make a lot of guys, Gilmore, Chandler Jones in Arizona, Xavier Howard with the Dolphins, and then maybe Aaron Rodgers, think twice about a holdout, just because it can be pretty steep financially if it becomes protracted.
Last thing I want to ask you, Joel, if Stephon Gilmore is really holding out for this 3-year extension, and if Bill Belichick does hold the line, could you see a trade? And what would be a reasonable expectation for the Patriots in terms of compensation if they do decide to deal this corner who, while still good and just fresh off a defensive player of the year a couple of years ago, is 31 and does play a position where guys don't generally last that long?
And he's coming off with a quad injury. Sometimes if a player can't get what he wants contractually, he shifts gears and wants a trade. That's what happened with Keenan McCardell. We were getting nowhere with the Buccaneers. Eventually we wanted out of town and did get out of town to the Chargers right at the trading deadline. So that could become a viable option. Also could be Belichick does not want to set the precedent that if you hold out, you get what you want if it comes to that, and would trade him and use that as an example to other players on the team, so they'll think twice about wanting to hold out in the future. Now, that being said, I heard there were rumors last year that the Patriots wanted a first-round pick for Gilmore. That's out of the question. He's going to be 31 in September, and the track record for corners on a go-forward basis at that age isn't pretty. So Slay went for a 3rd and 5th round pick. I think Gilmore's a better player, although there's a 2-year age difference. So I would look at that as the floor. And then we had a younger corner who had a checkered past, Marcus Peters, a couple of years ago, go from the Chiefs to the Rams for a 2nd and a 4th. So maybe it's going to be somewhere in between those two trade compensation or draft capital, the draft capital given up for those guys.
If you had to choose right now in terms of looking into your crystal ball, Joel, do you see a trade as more likely, or do you see this other option, this compromise option where maybe Bill Belichick just gives him a few $1 million in terms of a raise and Gilmore tries to set himself up for free agency next offseason? Which do you feel like is more likely, knowing what you know about both sides?
The compromise option. Things would have to go sideways for the trade, because it doesn't make sense for the Patriots to trade him after everything they've done to improve the roster, not really addressing cornerback in any meaningful way until now. So to me, that signals they want Gilmore around and just unless things get too acrimonious. So I suspect that it's going to be trying to work something out with him financially first, and trade would be the last resort.
A lot of Patriots fans taking a nice deep breath here. You say that, Joel, sitting back in their chairs, maybe just improve their day ever so slightly, knowing that, okay, the trade does feel like things would have to get a little bit wild for it to actually happen. But Joel Corry, thank you so much for being with us. If you haven't heard the Inside the Cap podcast, Joel is the host, does a phenomenal job. Nobody knows more about the cap, the way the league is functioning. He has that agent background that just gives us such a fresh perspective. It's a perspective, honestly, that we don't get to hear all that often. So Joel, thanks so much for joining us on Next Pats.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right, there you have it, Joel Corry. We thank him so much for spending some time with us. If he's Stephon Gilmore, he wants that Darius Slay deal. If he's Bill Belichick, He's hoping Gilmore takes some incentives. Pretty sizable chasm there, I would say. And maybe, just maybe, a few $1 million to get Gilmore back to the base salary he was originally supposed to get before the Patriots took money from this year and added it to his salary last year. Maybe that's enough. But again, that is still pretty sizable. There's a big difference between making $11, $12 million in 2021 and having a 3-year deal that pays him in 21, 22, 23, somewhere in the range of $17 million a year. So I don't sense panic coming from Gillette Stadium right now, from One Patriot Place right now. Devin McCourty talked to us about Stephon Gilmore last week. Bill Belichick, the way he has approached this disagreement in the media, at least, makes it seem like it is amicable at this point in time. And so there's not a lot of consternation at the moment. But again, a few $1 million versus a 3-year extension, if that's really what Gilmore's looking for, pretty sizable gap between those two things. And are they able to bridge it? That's what we're going to be watching oh so closely here on Next Pats, here on Early Edition, here on Boston Sports Tonight, on the Tom Curran's Patriots Talk podcast. Hopefully you guys are checking in on all of those and reading all of our stuff at NBCSportsBoston.com. I dove into the details of the punishments for a holdout into training camp. Again, those are some new rules established in last year's CBA that may dictate whether or not Stephon Gilmore is willing to sit out once we get to training camp for the Patriots late July and into August. So make sure you're checking that out. And of course, please rate, comment, subscribe, leave a question in the review section on Apple Podcasts for our Next Pats page, and we'll be sure to get to them. We'll be loaded up with mailbag questions, I'm hoping, in the next couple of weeks, and we'll be able to just really dive in on one massive reader, listener mailbag for an episode in the near future here. Until then, keep listening to Next Pats. We'll talk to you soon on the Tom Curran's Patriots Talk podcast, and we'll talk to you next week here on Next Pats.